Welcome back, guys. So in the previous video we saw how semi-adjustable articulators were designed, and we know that there is a component called the Facebow that is related to your semi-adjustable articulator. If you look at the Michigan classification of articulators, which is one of the most widely accepted classifications, you would notice that they are basically classified based on their acceptance of a Facebow record and by the number of movements of the mandible they can reproduce. Now, if you look at the definition of a Facebow, it goes that it's a caliper-like device that is used to orient your maxillary plane to the center of rotation of your condyles. What does this mean? It basically tells that if you look at a patient, right, there's a specific relationship between the maxillary plane, which is fused to the skull, and to this axis that passes through the center of your condyles, which is your transverse axis of rotation. The first question you might ask is, okay, there is a maxillary plane and a transverse axis, but why do I need to find the relationship between the two? You could understand this if you think about this as a doorway, a door, and the hinge. If you were to construct a door, you wouldn't be able to frame the door to the size of the doorway unless you know where the hinge was, because that hinge is a fixed point about which the door and the doorway have to interact. So if you're not able to find out where the hinge is in relation to the doorway, then you wouldn't be able to fabricate the size of the door. This is the basic idea of why we use a Facebow. The Facebow does this by a system of triangulation. Now, you guys know that what I am holding in my hand is a earpiece type Facebow, which is one of the arbitrary Facebows, right? I will get into why it's called an arbitrary Facebow soon. Now, if you notice, your glenoid fossa is actually very close to your external auditory meatus. Now, they did a study where they found out that this distance is usually in the range of plus or minus 5 millimeters. And if they were to use the external auditory meatus as a reference point instead of the actual glenoid fossa, then the error that you get in designing a restoration out of use of these reference points is actually only 0.2 millimeter, which is clinically negligible. The reason these are called as arbitrary Facebows is because they use an arbitrary point, which is the external auditory meatus, whereas a kinematic Facebow, which is a true Facebow, would actually aim to find the center of rotation of both the condyles, and it would be positioned over the skin, which is over the condyle itself. They use this as a reference point, and they use the infraorbital rim as a reference point, right? And they basically triangulated the position of the Frankfurt's horizontal plane using the Facebow, which is a caliper, and they connected this to the intraoral condition using a clutch assembly, is what you see here, and a bite fork. The idea behind doing this procedure is basically so that I can trap or capture the relationship between this, which is the Frankfurt's horizontal plane, to the relationship of the maxilla. So I'm basically capturing the position of the hinge of the door and the doorway. And I would be able to do this, which is use of this particular piece called as a transfer jig or a transfer assembly, and transfer that same position that the Facebow captured on the patient to the articulator, where the upper member represents my axis orbital plane or the Frankfurt's horizontal plane, and I have a transverse axis that passes through the two condylar elements in my semi-adjustable articulator. And this relationship of the maxillary plane to this is captured by this process of transferring the Facebow record from the patient to the articulator, and hence the name Facebow transfer. Now, in a three-plane articulator, which we are all used to during the undergrad days, we don't do this. We basically keep the maxillary cast flat between the upper and the lower members, and we just articulate it. Now, the advantage of using the Facebow is that I capture the angle of the maxilla exactly as it is in the patient. And when I do a bite record, and then mount the mandible, then I have the maxilla and the mandible articulated in the articulator in the exact same fashion as it is in the patient. Remember that in a 3-plane articulator, it would be oriented flat because we tie that thread around the middle of the articulator and then orient it flat. But in a semi-adjustable articulator, we want to mount it in the same angle that it is in the patient, which is what we do the Facebow transfer for. Only when we do this Facebow transfer and use a bite record to mount the patient's jaws or the casts into the articulator, then any future records that we would use to set the angles in your semi-adjustable articulator would make any sense. And that is why we do a Facebow transfer for mounting in a semi-adjustable articulator.